There are a lot of ways to grow your podcast, but none of them are created equal. Today, I'm challenging Justin to grade 10 different podcast growth tactics and explain why. We're keeping it simple with a classic grading system, A through F. The goal is to help you figure out which strategies are actually worth your time and which ones aren't. Welcome to Podcast Playbook. I'm Kyle, and alongside Justin, we run SimplePod Studios, where we help coaches, consultants, and advisors produce and grow their podcast. If you're looking for support with your show, head over to simplepodstudios.com or email me at kyle@simplepodstudios.com. Today, we're grading podcast growth tactics. Justin, are you ready?
I think I'm ready as I will ever be. Let's get into it, man. What do you got for me?
Let's start with a really controversial one just to kick things right off. So we have number one, posting on social media. You gave this a D ranking, but it looks like you were back and forth between C and D. Can you walk me through this?
Yes. So you kind of laid out the most controversial one, I think, on this list right from the get-go here. I'm teetering the line C and D. I try not to give myself any C minuses or D pluses. I went straight to either C or D, but I went with D. And I think a couple of things played into this. First things, I haven't honestly seen posting on social media drastically grow shows. I think most of the time that's because people are consuming on these platforms and then they move on and there's not a lot of click through. I don't think people are on social media looking for podcast recommendations. They're on social media for entertainment, to let some steam off, to decompress after a long day. And then on the other hand, it's super dependent on an algorithm. Many people try to promote their podcast on social media and they get next to nothing in terms of views. So you're super dependent on the algorithm in order to do this. And honestly, with this podcast mostly being geared towards coaches, advisors, consultants, the conversation I have with them around social media is usually they don't like posting on social media. And with that in mind, I find that if they're not already having some kind of strategy behind growing their social media, they're not posting organic content for their social media channels, just putting in podcast promotional content is not going to drastically change how many people they're following on social media, therefore not really going to bring any kind of new audience to the podcast overall. There might be one exception to this. We don't do a lot of entertainment-based shows. We don't have a lot of comedians or sports podcasts or things like that. Most of our clients, almost all of our clients are in the world of education. I see lots of people like to consume clips and podcast repurposed content from these entertainment-based shows, and I'm sure that helps them grow their show, but I don't see it for the education shows as much. I do find that people like to follow you before they follow your show, though. So I almost see social media as an opportunity for someone to taste test if they like you, if they can fall in love with you, if they're going to like the show or the content. So I did bump it up to a D for that reason, but I couldn't go any further than that because at the end of the day, it takes a lot of effort to grow on social media, to get people to convert from social media to your podcast. And I did want to put in the back of my head whenever I was ranking these strategies, a little bit of weight to effort versus reward or ROI. So I'm going to land with a D on this one, just for the reason that it can be a time suck. The effort versus return is pretty low, and it's hard to convert and execute simply with just repurposed podcast content. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on it. Do you feel like that grade is worth it, or would you grade it lower or higher?
I don't know about you, but I get on social media to swipe into the endless void of nothingness. I will say that a lot of the times when I'm getting on social media, it's really to just fill some time. It's very passive, the way that I'm consuming content. You're right that someone getting on social media to then find a show is probably not the mindset they're in. I would probably give this a C. I do think there's relatively easy ways to generate short form content if you're shooting video without really overthinking it. And I do think it can be kind of fun. And I know we're going to stick on using these 5 tactics to grow your podcast, not your brand, not your business. I think that's a really big caveat there. You've told me before that people have told you that they've listened to the show and you're like, oh, that's awesome. What episode have you listened to? And then they're like, oh, I've just been watching the clips on LinkedIn or something like that. And so there's a big difference between utilizing that to grow your show on the podcast players versus utilizing that to grow your audience wherever you're serving them their content, which I guess in this point would be social media.
I think that's actually a really good point. We were talking about this yesterday. I almost see social media as just another distribution channel. It's a Spotify or it's an Apple or it's a YouTube. It's social media. It's another place that people consume podcast, and you have to fit your podcast content into social media. You also brought up, I think, another really good point. With this grading, tried to separate my thoughts around, is this going to help you grow your podcast versus is this going to help you grow your business and your brand? If you encapsulated business and brand with this, easily this is a C, maybe even a B. I do think it's worth pursuing one social media channel because I have gotten plenty of leads from being active on LinkedIn. I know people think about me because I'm posting on LinkedIn whenever it comes to podcasts. I've gotten speaking opportunities because of that, and that's led to leads. So I'm not saying that social media is not worth it for your business. I'm just saying posting on social media is not worth it for growing your podcast.
Yep. And also, we're not saying that if you have 500,000 social media followers, you should not think about how to activate your social media channel to integrate it with your podcast. Okay. So growth tactic number 2, podcast guesting. This entails being a guest on other shows. You gave this a ranking of A and is the most predictable way that you've seen our clients grow their show. Tell me more.
Easily the easiest A on this list. Podcast guesting, like you just said there, most predictable way that I've seen across the board our clients grow their shows. Social media has worked for a small sliver of some of our clients. Podcast guesting works for nearly every single one of our clients. I've seen clients guest on the right shows, and we've seen them have huge spikes in their download numbers that whole published week. You know, we have a client, a financial advisor. He guested on a pretty big show in his niche. Immediately, 1,500 new listeners popped into that show. And we saw a lot of those listeners stick around too, which is probably actually one of the bigger benefits of this growth tactic versus some of the other growth tactics that we're going to talk about on this list. But in general, this is the reason why I love podcasting. It's so evergreen. You're going to guest on their show, and if that show continues to grow, your guest appearance on their show, that episode is probably going to continue to get listened to. So not only is it got to be published week, that is got to be driving listeners to your show, it's also got to be maybe a year or even 2 years later, especially if that show is optimized for search and you had a really high value conversation. I can easily see people picking up listeners a year after a guest appearance from certain shows. I also think it's really obvious that this is probably one of the most slam dunk ways because it's the only way to guarantee everyone that you're targeting, everyone that you're marketing to is a podcast listener. Mm-hmm. Unlike social media, where only 60 to 65% of the people on social media listen to podcasts, if you are guesting on a podcast, you know everyone listening is a podcast listener. Maybe it's their first time listening to a podcast, but more than likely, they've listened to hundreds of podcasts. I also love that whenever a host invites you on their show, they're almost transferring their trust to you. And you know there's such built-in trust from a host to a listener. So in order to get that trust from a host is awesome. And then finally, you usually get to pitch your show at the very end of their episode, right when a lot of listeners might not be done with what they're doing. So they're going to be looking for the next episode that they want to listen to. And sure enough, you're pitching your show, sharing an episode that they could potentially go and check out. And it's so easy for them to transition out of your guest appearance and into listening to your podcast for the very first time. All of this to say that there are caveats too. I do think guesting on the wrong shows, it being a misaligned audience or even just an audience that's too small can feel like a wasted time. I've had plenty of clients that have gone on a guesting spree and haven't seen a lot of results from that. And more times than not, like I said, it's misaligned audiences or they're guesting on 10 or 20 shows that maybe have 20, 30, 40 downloads total. So they're only really addressing 400 to 800 listeners during those 10 to 20 appearances. And that might not necessarily move the needle. But I think if you have the skills to find shows, to pitch host, to share value, to pitch your show whenever you're guest appearing, this is going to easily be an A. I think the only thing that's a bummer about this growth tactic is it's pretty time intensive. and it's not scalable. And you can only spend so much time guesting on other shows. You can't really scale your own time in that way. So for me, it's an A, but I could see an argument to a B if you really wanted to put in the time intensive aspect to this. What about you, Kyle?
I think I'll give this one a B, not because I don't think it's super effective, but I do think it's hard to implement. There's a certain art that comes along with pitching yourself to be on a show, and we could do a whole podcast episode covering how to do that effectively. And then also finding good shows within your niche that I do feel like, since it's so time intensive and also such a one-off task, like at the end of the episode, you can think, oh, I just need to repurpose those clips and post them on social media. There's a process, there's a workflow in place to be able to do that. But when it comes to podcast guesting, I do feel like you're kind of staring at a blank canvas. But you're targeting 100% of your listeners are actively consuming podcasts. And then furthermore, actively consuming podcasts in your niche. The only reason I wouldn't be giving this an A is because it does take a little bit of strategy to implement.
Yeah, actually, last spring, I did run a newsletter campaign. There was a small group of us that worked on podcast pitching and podcast guesting. So if you're feeling a little bit lost in that area, happy if you send me an email, justin@simplepodstudios.com. I'll forward you along all of the content that I made for that series. It goes everything from finding your signature topics to finding shows to pitching those shows and then actually being a slam dunk guest. So feel free to reach out to me if you're looking for some help or support with that, justin@simplepodstudios.com, and I'll forward you those emails.
All right, so growth tactic number 3, podcast reviews and ratings. You gave this a D ranking. Even thought about giving this an F ranking. I think you should have just gave this an F ranking. Why is that?
So podcast reviews and rating. This is simply asking for ratings and reviews on your show. I was looking at a list of podcast growth tactics that are typically recommended to first-time podcasters. And this showed up and I was like, man, I have to address this. Because I remember when I first started podcasting, how much weight or emphasis that I put behind, I need to ask for ratings and reviews. And part of that was probably because I wanted to build out some social proofing, which I do think is a great benefit of requesting ratings and reviews. But the other thing is, I think I misunderstood or didn't understand that a lot of the podcast players, what I thought is they put more weight into shows that had ratings and reviews. But many of the podcast players, Apple and Spotify especially, have moved away from taking into consideration at all the number of ratings and reviews on your shows. So not only does this not really get any new ears or eyeballs onto your show, it doesn't really help you perform better in search rankings or in the charts. But that doesn't explain why I'm giving it a D, though. I did briefly mention social proofing, and I do think it feels different to land on a podcast for the very first time and see that they have 1, 2, maybe 3 reviews on their show versus landing on a podcast that has 100+ reviews on their show. I translate that to Amazon reviews. If I'm out shopping for something and it doesn't have a whole lot of reviews, and maybe those reviews, 1 is a 3 and 1's a 5, I might be a little bit more hesitant to actually press buy. Same with an empty restaurant. If I walk into a restaurant and it is completely empty versus it's completely full, that is also probably got to turn me off. So I do think there's some.
The doors.
I'm walking out the door. That's weird. I don't want to be the only person in a restaurant unless it's 4 p.m. Then okay, I understand. But if it's 6 p.m. and I walk into a restaurant and there's no one there, I'm not sitting down. I gave it a D because if you're really good at getting people to leave you ratings and reviews, you'll probably have a pretty active and supportive audience, and that in itself is going to lead to a lot of word of mouth, or a lot of opportunity for you to engage that audience to help grow and support your show. But that's not fair. I should have put word of mouth on here, not, requesting ratings and reviews. But I want to tell you a story about one of our other shows, Five Minded. This is a show I've been running for 6 years. And every August, I would do a rating and review push. I would just reach out to people that I know listen to the podcast, maybe former guest, and just ask them, hey, if you could you just leave me a rating and review on the show if you really like the show and you've checked it out before? And I'd do that at the beginning of August. And what I found out was August
Your
tended
downloads went up.
Every time. My downloads went up every single time. And it was so strange until I thought about it. At the time, that show was not very big. I was maybe getting 50 to 100 downloads per episode on that show. But when I thought about it, and the reason why I saw downloads typically double, it went from 500 a month to 1,000 a month, is because I was driving traffic to my podcast feed.
Mm.
I was asking usually 25, 30, 50 people to go leave me a rating review. And half of them might jump over to my feed, leave me a rating review. A lot of them had already left me a rating review, but I reminded them that I had a podcast. So then they'd go to my feed, they'd see what I've been up to over the last 3 months, and they would start downloading episodes. So in return, I gave it a D because I do think it's a sneaky way to think through a growth tactic that I think is overlooked, which is just one-to-one request. Just asking people to check out your show, to let them know that you have new episodes in your feed, and to just drive some traffic to your feed. I think this is a really good strategy for that. But this would be a D-, I'm going to be honest.
Yeah. We've talked about the stage of podcasting that you're in and what areas you should be focused on to grow your show. And if your show is in the first stage where you're just trying to create momentum and grow your audience, I do think that guerrilla marketing where you're just reaching out to people one-to-one is such an effective strategy, often overlooked strategy. This isn't a tactic that we have on our list, but community building, I would give an A+ to. I've seen so many shows do this correctly, especially with like Facebook groups and whatnot. We had one client who was a moderator on a Reddit forum that grew his show by just being really prevalent there, and then just being value-driven, helping people out. But anyways, Justin, I'm right there with you. I give this one an F in terms of growth strategy.
You gave it an F, I gave it a D. Either way, I don't think it should be a high priority, at least in terms of growth tactics. Love your thoughts, though. Focus on it on launch. Go get yourself 20, 25 rating reviews. Maybe ask once a year on your birthday, on your podcast anniversary. And outside of that, focus on some other things. Honestly, if you're going to do a standard CTA like that, focus on asking people to follow and subscribe to the show instead. That's what these podcast players really want to see. People committing by hitting that follow button, not necessarily committing by hitting ratings or reviews.
Yeah. Well, we're going to get into growth tactic number 4 here, and that is paid ads. You've gave this a rank of B. And we've implemented this paid ad strategy with multiple clients now. What have you seen?
I give this a solid B. Honestly, this is so predictable. Paid ads is great. And we've done this across multiple different shows. And it has led, like I said, to a very predictable uptick in downloads. Of course, the big downside is it's paid. It's paid to play. You're going to have to spend some money. But it has a lot of upside too. Probably one of the biggest upsides is it's not very time intensive. Unlike podcast guesting, you don't have to sink a lot of your own time into paid ad strategies. You just have to sink your money into it. I also love that it's immediate traffic. Like you can go buy a paid ad today and start seeing traffic come to your podcast tomorrow. So I think for both of those reasons, especially if you're tight on time and you're looking for some immediate growth with your show, paid ad strategies should be something that you should consider. And if you've done enough of these, you can start making the math make sense for you. Meaning that you know how much you're going to have to pay for an ad. Eventually, when you do enough of those, you're going to know what is your acquisition cost, how many people are subscribing or listening to the show based on that. And if you go the opposite way with your business and you figure out how many listeners is your show and how many of those listeners convert to prospects, and then how many of those prospects convert to clients, and how much is a lifetime value of your client, you can start figuring out this is how much a podcast listener could potentially make for my business. And if a paid ad strategy is less than that cost in terms of acquisition, then you can go ahead and just press the repeat button on that. It's got to be something that's very predictable for you. With this in mind, though, not all paid ads are created equal. I gave this a blanket B, but there are lots of paid ad strategies that I don't think work. We've seen some clients do some social media paid ad strategies to try to convert people from social media into their podcast. I haven't seen that work really well. And there's also just so many options in terms of paid ad strategies. There's companies like Podroll that's got a pretty cool product that's out there. Audience Lift, which is out there. But my favorite paid ad strategies, the ones I've seen most successful, are podcast banner ads. Buying ads in podcast players like Overcast, Podcast Addict, Player FM. You can go out and purchase ads that show up in the podcast feed. So whenever someone is looking for a new show, your show shows up as a paid show or a featured show alongside other shows that might show up there naturally in the search itself. But of course, this has got to get expensive pretty quickly. So if you don't have a strong conversion method from listener to client, you just might not see the ROI from this. So I think you should be careful with how you implement this, but I don't think you should be so cautious that you don't give it a try at least a couple of times. Overall, though, I'm going to stamp of approval on this one, give it a solid B.
I like that ranking a lot. I think a B makes sense, but it is like you're saying, this could be such a wide-ranging grade depending on how you're implementing the strategy. You could just be lighting money on fire, or this could be a solid investment that you make for your podcast. I will say that I would love to try out the ad strategy where you pay for ads within the podcast medium, whether it be feature swaps, podcast mid-roll swaps with other shows within your niche or alongside your niche. Maybe requires some networking with people. Obviously, it's got to be a two-way street there. But I do feel like that could be really, really effective, almost kind of coinciding with podcast guesting. But let's move on to our fifth strategy. Ask every guest to share the episode. You gave this a rank of C. Why is that?
Another one that popped up on the list whenever I was looking at growth strategies often recommended to first-time podcasters. I think part of me thinks, sure, of course. Like, why would you not ask a guest to share an episode? I don't think it's very time-intensive. I don't think it's very hard. I think it's a fair ask. If you're sharing a platform and your audience with them, they could do the same for you. But in terms of actually growing your show, I gave it a C, maybe even a C minus if I were allowed to give minuses, because I just don't see it work that well. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. First, you're highly dependent on someone else. You can make it as easy as possible, and I think you should try to make it as easy as possible to have someone successfully share your show by staying in communication with them throughout the production process and, of course, on publish date, making sure that they actually just had a fantastic time being interviewed on your show, creating shareable assets or tagging them whenever you share out your assets. There are a lot of, I think, low-hanging fruit in terms of increasing the success that a guest will share. But at the end of the day, you can't press the button for them. So you're just relying on them to share the show out. And they could have all the best intentions, but maybe they're on vacation whenever your episode goes live. Maybe they just went on a podcast tour and they've already shared out 10 episodes, so they don't want to share out more. Maybe they don't feel like the conversation they had on your show is really relevant to the audience that they're trying to build on their platforms. There are a host of different reasons that a guest might not share, and you really can't do anything about that. I also think another big issue with this is when a guest shares their episode, you might get a temporary bump, but you're not necessarily going to get an ongoing bump. This is, I think, a little bit of the difference between you guesting on other shows versus a guest sharing their appearance on your show. You just won someone over in a guest appearance and they fell in love with you and they checked out your show. They decided, actually, I do like this show a lot. They subscribed to your show and now they're with you. Versus a big name guest or any guest really shares their episode out and their audience floods over to your show because they want to hear that guest. They don't necessarily want to hear you. Sure, there might be a small portion of these people that are like, oh, actually, this person's kind of interesting. They have a pretty cool show here. But at the end of the day, they're probably going to be a one and done. And they're going to bounce out of your show after they've listened to this guest appearance episode and never come back and listen to another episode. So for that reason, I think it's a C, maybe a C minus. Once again, I think if you put the right processes in place in terms of guest selection and all of the things that I talked about earlier in terms of making it easier for a guest to share, you can have a pretty high success rate with this. But overall, I wouldn't rank this higher or rely on this as a very strategic strategy to grow your podcast.
I think this is why a lot of podcasters feel pulled to make clips so that their guests have something to share. And then at that point, you're relying on them to do the thing. But I do think a lot of platforms are making it a lot easier for you to collab and tag people, which I think will be great. And I think the community building within these platforms, such as YouTube or wherever, will just continue to build and build as these platforms really find ways to create that social media side of their platform.
Yeah, it's cool that YouTube put out collaborations for their videos too. I think that's been helpful with some of our clients and some friends that I know podcast. That's awesome. If you wanted to bring this up to a B, I would take this one step further. And rather than just asking every guest to share the episode, I would target specific guests that you had a great time creating an episode with and work to build that relationship as an ongoing collaborator. I've had way more success coming out every year with 5 to 10 new collaborations. I go on their show, maybe we do a newsletter swap, maybe we do a social media takeover, maybe we do a presentation live together on stage, maybe we become routine guests on each other's shows. I think there's a lot of opportunity to continue building a relationship and really turn someone into a content collaborator with you versus just relying on every single guest to share the episode and then being done with that relationship overall. So maybe less focus on every single guest and more focused on the guest that you really want to continue building a relationship with.
All right, folks, that's all we have for today's episode. We've covered 5 tactics that you can use to grow your podcast: posting on social media, podcast guesting, podcast reviews and ratings, paid ads, and asking every guest to share the episode. This has been part 1. We actually have part 2 coming out next episode. And there are 5 more growth tactics, maybe 5 growth tactics that you aren't necessarily thinking about to utilize in your own podcast. Justin, this has been super fun covering these 5 strategies to grow your podcast. We actually have 5 more coming out in the next episode.
Yeah, man. I am looking at the bottom half of this list here, and you saved all the good ones for the end, dude. This is going to be exciting. I'm excited to continue to rank these. I got a couple of A's. I got a couple of F's that are coming up here. So thanks so much for facilitating this conversation, man. Excited for next week's conversation. This is Podcast Playbook. Make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss next week's episode. I'm Justin. You can find me at justin@simplepodstudios.com. And of course, Kyle's here on the other side. That's Kyle@simplepodstudios.com. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week.